Okay, welcome everyone to the training for building resilience, which is to be able to deliver a workshop for both Plan for Resilience, which is for working people, and for From Surviving to Thriving, which is for post-secondary students. So as you can see on the screen, I'm just asking you to have your facilitator guide open. The way this will work is that I will walk you through some of the pieces in the facilitator's guide. Then I'm going to walk you through the actual delivery of the workshop. And at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about the logistics. So if you have that handy, this will make it easier for you to follow along. My name is Mary Ann Baynton, and I'm the Director for Strategy and Collaboration with Workplace Strategies for Mental Health. And this workshop and the resources, Plan for Resilience and From Surviving to Thriving, are available in French and English on our website, and they're free to anyone, compliments of Canada Life. So Canada Life, for the past 12 years, has been supporting Workplace Strategies for Mental Health to develop free tools and resources for workplaces. And what we have done recently is expanded that a little bit into other areas, like for post-secondary. And I have with me today one of the people who helped to develop From Surviving to Thriving, David McDonald. And he's just going to talk to you a little bit about the shift that we made from Plan for Resilience to the tool From Surviving to Thriving for post-secondary.
Hi, everybody. This is David. I think that it's really important that we start earlier in building resilience, and that's a way to set people up so that they're ready once they get into the workplace, and I think that helps even more. Of course, there is an increase in the mental illness in post-secondary, or at least we're recognizing it now. And I think it's really, really important, and it's really great stuff that we're doing to help them to build these skills for coping and for understanding what's going on.
Yeah. And David's much closer to having graduated post-secondary than I am, so we can take his word for that. You can see on your screen there the table of contents, and just to help you understand what's in your facilitator guide is some information to help set you up, and we're going to go through some of that about what this is, how you should do it. And then we actually go through slide by slide, and we're not giving you a script that you must read. What we're giving you is some ideas. We know that when you're facilitating a workshop, the more that you can add in your own stories, your own take to this, the more effective you'll be. So as I go through this with you, and I'll tell you some of my stories, what I would like you to do is in your facilitator guide, write down what pops into your head about an experience you had or a story that you've heard that you think would be particularly relevant to that, to help your audience really understand the point of what we're talking about. In the appendix, you'll see is where we have the evidence, the Queen's University study on From Surviving to Thriving, some of the work that we did with McMaster University. And this is important, especially if you are in a post-secondary institution, to be able to clearly articulate the evidence behind this resource, that it's not just a fun time or an interesting exercise, but it actually can reduce distress and improve the sense that you can cope. And we know that both of these things are so important to our mental well-being. Now, the intention behind the Plan for Resilience and From Surviving to Thriving was that you understand what builds your resilience, and then the hope is that you then take action to build your resilience over time. You don't build your resilience from reading about it, you build it from actually trying things and reflecting on the fact that you were successful, that you did cope, or that you didn't fold because something difficult came up. You got through it, you thrived through it. And also in the appendix are some pre-planning worksheets, and we will look at those at the very end as well, just to help you with sort of the logistics of setting up a workshop and organizing things in advance. We want to make this as easy for you as we possibly can. And I deliver workshops all the time. I have for decades now. And I have to tell you that this workshop is one of the easiest ones that I have ever delivered because it's about self-reflection. It's about the participants journaling. And so from the presenter's point of view, you give a little background context, you let people self-discover, and then you wrap it up. And both the getting the context and the wrap-up is included in the facilitator's guide for you. And as I said, your job through this training is to think about other stories that are personal to you so that you have that passion, you have that expertise in it that you can add in some of these places. All right, so moving on. What's important to know about this is that you don't have to use this as a script, as I say. You can use it as guidance, but the information in here, the suggested wording, is based on the evidence, and so it can be helpful for you, so you can read through them. The facilitator notes, unlike the wording, are just ways that you can facilitate that we think might be helpful. You know, it's like, how long do you wait before you stop? I do things like I'll say, when you're done, please put your pen down, because that's how I'll know that you're finished and you can continue reading or looking. But it's tiny little tips like that that can make it easier for you. The evidence that I talked to you about, what we're showing you here on this page, which is at the back, is some of the literature that really guided us in writing this to begin with. So for anybody who wants to go and do more reading, that wants to go and look at the foundational literature that guided us, it's there for you. The Queen's University study, we were, and so were they actually, really pleasantly surprised at how effective this resource was. We did this study so that we could learn and make changes to it, and the changes that we made after their study were very minor. We are thinking now about looking at more longitudinal studies, and I will follow up online with everybody when that happens. So here's the different ways that you can present this to your audiences. 3 hours we're saying is an ideal time. That allows you to have, you know, a couple of stretch breaks for people. It also allows you to give them more time. There's a couple of places where they talk in here, and you can stretch that time. I actually find 2.5 hours is ideal with one break for me, but you'll see that we've also given you options if you only have 2 hours or if you only have 1 hour. If that's the only opportunity you get, I'll tell you why I prefer the longer time. I think that whether you're a post-secondary student or you're someone in the workplace, you're probably pretty busy. And the idea that you're going to go back and complete this on your own later is slim to none. And for that reason, I would rather know that they're walking away with it completed, that they've really thought this through, because then the skills that are in there are immediately applicable, transferable. If you only give them an hour, they're going to hear about it, but they may not have gotten to the point where they could apply it in everyday life. So that's my suggestion, but I know the reality is sometimes an hour is all you're going to get, and better to open their eyes to the idea that they can contribute to their own resilience than not. All right, so here we have a breakdown of how long the different slides would take. And once you're more familiar with them, you can come back to this page, page 7, and look and think, okay, if I'm picking and choosing what I'm going to say, which ones can I get rid of, or which ones can I just skim over? So that's really just helping you have an overview of how you might do it. You'll notice that some slides we're actually going to have a conversation and some we don't. What's important for you to know is anything that's really personal that could be emotional, we don't talk about. We don't talk in small group about. We don't ask people to expose themselves. So I'll get back to that in a little bit because it's further on where we actually have that conversation with your participants. On this page here, page 9, you can see that we're recommending that we acknowledge territorial lands. In Winnipeg, where Canada Life's head office is, and in Toronto, where many of the people that are using this are, we've already got them written. But CAUT very kindly has given us acknowledgements for almost every area where there are post-secondary institutions. And so you can go to that website and you can find what that is. It's just a very quick way to recognize the lands that we're on. We also have suggested welcome wording, and of course, if you already know your audience, you can say it in any way that you want to. If your audience already knows the location, for instance, if you were doing this to a classroom or to a work team that's intact, you may not need some of these things, like where the washroom's located, but it's always good to remind people, if you're doing a longer session, when the break will be, so that if they're squirming in their seats, they know, okay, I only have to wait 5 minutes. If you're taking a break for lunch, let them know, and to tell them when you'll be finished. Again, people are busy. They may have booked this months ago. They show up and now they're wondering. So we just try to put their mind at ease. And of course, the housekeeping issues about where the emergency exits are, where the washrooms are located, all of that is really important for people who aren't familiar with your location. And you can see on the slide here that we're already saying if you haven't taken the VIA Strengths Inventory, and hopefully you've given them information beforehand, and we'll talk about that, that they can do it in between. Like they literally could do it while they're sitting there waiting. That's why I always have this slide up when people come in, so that if they're there early and they haven't taken the survey, they can do it while they're waiting. I personally like people to ask questions throughout. If you prefer that they ask questions at the end, then that's definitely up to you. And I usually like to ask if there's any questions about it before we start. So all of this, again, is optional, whatever works for you. So this is page 71. So again, this is at the back, but I just want you to see that we've actually given you some email wording so that you can send it out to the participants, or the organizer can. So for instance, if your organizer is a team leader, if it's a professor, if it is someone from HR, you can just simply give them this wording and say, can you please ask people to complete the VIA Strengths Inventory by forwarding them this. And of course, the link is in there and the information about it is in there. It is important, I think, that we tell them they don't have to buy anything, because the website does offer reports that you can purchase, but it's not necessary for what we're doing. You're only looking for their, say, top 3 character strengths so that they can use them in an activity later on. Okay. So, starting this session, and you want to start it with a story, if you have one, about somebody who bounced back after adversity, after something that happened that was really difficult. And to explain that that's really the core purpose. It's not about you being tough, you never being stressed out, you never having to deal with challenges. It really is about that life is going to happen to us. We're going to experience stress, frustration, disappointment, loss, tragedy, but that resilience is being able to feel that completely, deeply, and to accept those feelings, but then to be able to bounce back, then to be able to become well balanced again and carry on. And that's the important story. We all have those things that happen. And for those of you who are presenting, I want to say that even though we know that resilience is one of the preventive factors for people not choosing to take their life, we don't want to mention it at the session. And, you know, the issue of contagion is always controversial, whether talking about it actually makes it better or worse, but we're not going to take that chance in delivering this session to an audience. So you know that that's part of what we hope, is that this is prevention, but it's unless someone actually asks you a question, which has never happened in the dozens of times I've presented it, we're asking that you don't bring it up. What we want to focus on instead is helping people to deal with whatever life throws at them in a way that's healthier for them. Now, this next part is what I was talking to you about, is we want to specifically say that during this session, we want people to keep what they're writing confidential. Of course, they can share with whoever they want after the session is over, but this is meant to be a time of self-reflection, and you can't reflect when you're talking in the way that's important for this. Understanding yourself, understanding how you think, understanding how you react. And so we want this to be a safe space where everyone can be totally honest with themselves, because they know they don't have to share. So I think this is an important piece that I really want you to bring across to all of the participants. Even though there will be a couple of times we're going to ask them to share, what we're asking them to share are the positives, the coping strategies that they want to try out, that maybe somebody else has already used successfessly. We want them to share healthy coping strategies. We want them to share the positives, not their stressors, not their responses to stress. So if you can make sure, and you'll see in the book again where to bring that up. Okay, so what we're doing now is I'm going to walk you through a couple of times. I'm going to step back and talk about why you're doing certain things. But right now I want you to take out either the plan for resilience, if you are somebody who is really in the work world and has been for a few years, or from surviving to thriving, as if you are someone who is a student, a post-secondary student now, or someone who's just very recently graduated. And I'll walk you through actually experiencing this, and you can flip back and forth to your facilitator's guide to make notes, but you can also complete or look at the booklet itself. Okay, so I would start by saying, welcome to Building Resilience, to developing your own plan. If you haven't done so already, please take the VIA survey before we start, which will be in X number of minutes. And then I just leave this up. So those who are there can start that, and we start the session on time. Before I go forward, I would be, when I start the session, that's when I would give the land acknowledgement, I would thank the organizer, and I would give the housekeeping information. At this point, for those of you who are in post-secondary institutions, people can be doing either of these plans, and we created it specifically so that staff, students, and faculty can be in the same room, but they're working on slightly different plans. So you can facilitate the same way whether you have one or both in the room. Now, people can choose whatever they want. We're not going to tell them that they have to use one plan or another, but here's how we are thinking about it. If somebody is under the age of 20 or they are a full-time student, then From Surviving to Thriving is more likely to be relevant because it speaks to the stressors that happen while you're in school. But if somebody's over the age of 30, then probably Planning for Resilience is more relevant because now they have more complicated life stressors than what a student would have, because they may have had or they currently have full-time work. They may have family, their own family. They may have parents that they're concerned about. And so just because of their life experience, Planning for Resilience might be more relevant. But here's the catch. If you're between the ages of 20 and 30 and you're not a full-time student, then it could be either or, all right? If they're more into the young adult social scene, they're not raising children, they're not in school, but working full-time, it really could be either or. So there's no harm in choosing one or the other. It's just the relevance, and you'll be able to see that when you look at the stressors in particular, but also some of the coping strategies that may be more relevant for students. So you have this slide up. You may or may not need to spend a bit of time explaining it, but that's really the way we've thought it through. So that's what the slide looks like. And it's important to bring to their attention that this is not meant as a crisis intervention tool. So we're not looking for people who are currently in a mental health crisis or a life crisis and saying, let's sit down and fill this out because that will make you well. This is about building resilience when someone's well enough to do so. Having said that, in the Queen's University study, the follow-up to their study, they said that it was interesting that when they looked at the data, the people that came into the workshop most distressed had the biggest decrease in distress. Well, it kind of makes sense, right? If you are distressed, then, and you're thinking about, I actually can cope, there are people I can reach out to, there are resources available, that would be more calming than if you thought, well, I'm fine and I'm fine when I leave. But again, in some places they're using this, but it's counselors using it with someone who is distressed because the counselor believes that they're at the stage where this would be helpful and they're supporting them to do it. So hopefully that's clear that this is not medical, this is not therapy. This is a proactive tool to help people discover healthy coping strategies. In this one here, this really is a story that is from me personally, because years ago I was asked to deliver what they called a light-hearted session on resilience to employees who had been, at the time they called it right-sized, meaning many of their coworkers had been terminated, that people in there had been forced to take on positions that they never applied for, that they weren't comfortable with, that they didn't want, but it was either that or lose your job. They told me that management was also very stressed, and so they were going back to sort of the command and control model where they were just barking out orders to people, that everybody was being asked to do more, and stress levels were off the charts. And yet they said to me, we want you to come and do a lighthearted talk on resilience. And I said, well, what are you doing to help the employees manage their stress and adjust to the new job? And they said, well, we don't have control over that. We just want this lighthearted talk. I said, well, what are you doing to help managers manage in a safer way that they're not contributing to the stress? And they said, no, like, we can't tell the managers anything. We just want this lighthearted talk. So at that point, I said to them, I don't think you want me. I'm a mental health advocate. I think you want a comedian if you want a lighthearted talk when everybody is so stressed out. And I refused to do the session. I felt like they were saying, we're going to have a toxic, damaging workplace, and you ought to learn to laugh it off or suck it up. And I felt every time I heard the word resilience that my back would go up, that they're just saying, let's blame the victims. It's your fault that you're stressed out. It's not our fault that we're creating the stress. So that's what this slide is about. And the reason that we included it here isn't because I like my own stories. It's because there's other people who will feel that resistance to the word resilience like I did. And so you're addressing that resistance right up front. Then we tell them what resilience actually is. And I say, has anybody ever experienced any of these things in life? And of course, there's very few people who haven't experienced some or all of these things. And we explain that that's what resilience is. It's not about avoiding these things or laughing them off or shoving them down and saying, I'm not going to deal with it. It's about understanding that that's life, that these things will happen, but that we can not only recover from them, but that we can thrive through them. We can thrive afterwards. We can learn to deal with these things, to recognize that they're going to come, anticipate that, experience them, and then move on. And we talk about burnout, and that burnout has these characteristics that are very similar in many people who have experienced it. One is that they usually have poor boundaries. So they're working long hours, they're not taking care of themselves, and when something happens, they're already without any mental or physical reserve. So they don't have the ability to bounce back because they've exhausted themselves. There's also that feeling that they were working so hard, trying for so long, and nobody is appreciating the efforts that they've made. And many of them talked about what they felt was the breaking point, where somebody questioned their integrity, somebody canceled a project that they were very passionate about, somebody was gossiping about them or questioning the value of their work. They were blindsided by this, and they folded like a house of cards. Now, if you look at it, that event is rarely what actually led to burnout. It's the long time of not taking care of themselves, not having any reserve mentally or physically that allowed them to collapse. But it is that one thing that made them question everything that they have put their effort in for that was the point at which they collapsed. And the tough thing about burnout is that often people were putting work ahead of friends, ahead of family, ahead of relationships, ahead of their own health. And so when work no longer provided that feeling of value, of competency, of purpose, it's often that there's not much else left and they're starting at nothing. And that's why it's such a difficult place to be and why we really want people to avoid it if they possibly can. As somebody who burned out, it's a long and really lonely road back. And when I had the opportunity to talk with, I think it was 36 other people who had burned out when we hosted a roundtable, and we all talked about it, I thought it took me forever to have energy again, to have enthusiasm again. But for me, it was about 3 months. That seemed like a lifetime, but there's people who went through this for years, and we really want to prevent that. It's not fun. And we talk about traumatic incidents like post-traumatic stress disorder, and we look at the common elements there. People feeling that they were powerless against the trauma that happened to them, which then means they feel powerless afterwards, that they really can't control life, that they can't have any power over what happens. They often will describe feeling that they could have or should have done something different. They feel blamed for the trauma, even though they felt powerless in the moment, or they feel that somebody else could have or should have done something different, that they intentionally were cruel to them or to someone else. And they also talk about being blindsided, that the trauma was unexpected. When I was working with soldiers from the Department of National Defense, and I asked, well, why doesn't every soldier who goes across the wire, meaning into the theater of war, why don't they all have post-traumatic stress disorder? And one of the soldiers said he had a theory, and the theory was that those soldiers that went over expecting to be a hero, expecting to make the world a better place, to protect and save people, that those soldiers were more likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder than those who went over saying, I know I'm going to do things that I would never do in civilian life. I know there are going to be things that really compromise my values, my sense of integrity, but that's the job. In other words, those who expected, anticipated that they would have to do things that were horrible were less likely to be traumatized. If we translate that to the average citizen, if we anticipate that bad things are going to happen to good people, if we anticipate that violence happens sometimes and it's not your fault, if we anticipate that accidents happen sometimes and we can't always do anything about it, we are less likely to suffer the long-term negative impacts that come from feeling powerless, feeling that we could have or should have done something different. So all of this is to say that we know that traumatic incidents and the negative impact of them can be lifelong. And what we want to do is help people that go through traumatic incidents to also be able to bounce back eventually. And we look at something as simple as conflict or bullying, and yet we know that this also can have a very long-term negative impact on people, that they make assumptions about what people are thinking or doing when they're saying things that are hurtful. We can assume that it's intentionally being cruel. We can have misperceptions about what it means to ourselves and our identity when other people bully us. What's interesting about all this is when we look at these elements, that they're very common to burnout, to trauma, to being bullied or being involved in a conflict. And all these things can break us down. But here's the good news, is that what we know is that the elements that are resilience can help build us back up, or even better, can prevent the worst impacts from all of these things. So the common resilient elements that we're going to be talking about are self-awareness, so knowing yourself, knowing how you're going to respond, to anticipating challenges in life that could and may happen, and to develop coping strategies before we need them, and to understand the value of social connections and how we can make a difference in building them for ourselves. So all of this is part of what resilience is. This piece here, post-traumatic growth, I think is probably one of the most important concepts. And I usually ask how many people know about it, and often very few do. So we talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. Most people know what that is. Post-traumatic growth happens more often, but we don't talk about it, we don't recognize it, and yet it happens all the time. So in your facilitator guide, there's a couple of examples. Nelson Mandela is one I like to talk about because he was imprisoned for over 2 decades. And yet he came out to make a positive difference in the world. He came out still optimistic about what could be done, about what he could do, and the contribution he could make. We know about parents who lose a child, which, you know, seems like the most horrendous thing that could ever happen. But yet, many of them will turn their lives around to help other people. I have a relative who had a baby at full term, and the baby died just before the delivery date. For 2 years, this person grieved and was just overwhelmed with the loss, and then turned it all around and became a grief counselor who has made a difference in many people's lives. This is what post-traumatic growth is, not shake it off, let it go, feel it, experience it, but then look at what can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? How could I contribute from what my pain was to help other people? What we're asking people to do is to purposefully, intentionally, when they are coming through a traumatic incident, to consider how can I use this for myself or for others in a positive way. You don't want to ask somebody like my relative while they're grieving in that state, oh, so what can you learn from this? That's not fair and it's not helpful. But when someone is coming out the other side of the trauma, to really look at it. I mean, we can make this even a micro-learning, and you'll see when we get to the opportunities for growth and development that you can have just a tiny mistake, a tiny challenge, And you can still, in that moment, because it's not a trauma, say, what can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? And that is a big part of being resilient. All right, so this is where we bring them back to the book itself. And you can see that on the slide presentation, we have page numbers for those who are in school and page numbers for those who are at work. If you choose to use this for only one group or the other, then feel free to delete the opposite one. That's okay if you want to do that. Some people will use it strictly in workplaces, and some people may use it strictly for students, so the option is there for you. But let's imagine that you've got all of those in there. You would say the same thing because what's written on the page is what's differentiated, not the actual discussion about whatever it is. So when we're talking about automatic responses to stress, I like to say that these are involuntary. These aren't your chosen responses. These aren't your intellectual or cognitive responses. These are the thoughts, the physical or emotional responses that happen without you even choosing them. And this is where we would remind everybody to come back to the idea that you are not going to share these. You're going to look at what your automatic responses are. You're going to check them off, but we also want them to think about another concept while they're going through this. And that is, as you're looking through these and you know, yeah, this is my automatic response, when you're looking at the ones that aren't yours, think about people you know for whom it may be their automatic response. So, for example, if you have somebody who every time you're getting into an argument or a debate about something, a discussion about an important issue, they have to go somewhere or they shut down or they clam up, and you get really frustrated thinking they're just being passive aggressive, they're just not wanting to talk, could this be their response to stress? That when they're stressed, they withdraw. And, you know, on the other hand, what about the people who, when they're stressed, they start to attack someone else because that's their protection going up? That if they feel that somebody or something isn't going to happen properly, they look around to focus on someone else and what they're doing wrong. So it's just to help people not only to learn about themselves, but to learn about other people. Because if we know when someone's in a stress response, rather than reacting to them, we can actually be curious about what's happening. And that makes us more helpful as well. So the direction for this one is simply to check off the ones that apply to you and consider if you know anybody else who has the other responses. Then we give them the time they need to fill it out, and, you know, it depends on your audience. Some people go through it quite quickly because they're very aware of themselves and aware of other people, and others take, you know, 5-10 minutes, it depends. I often will wait until there's only 1 or 2 people left still writing. And what I do is I lower my voice and say, well, the last couple people are completing theirs. We'll talk about automatic responses to stress. Did you notice? And so you can carry on your presentation so that everybody else isn't bored, and yet you're respectful of the people who are still finishing. And as long as there's just a couple left, you can leave them to do that and go. The other thing is just to remind people, just as for those of you who are finished early, if you want to go onto your device and finish your VIA Strengths Inventory, you could do that now. All right, so I'm not going to give you the whole time to finish it because anybody who's listening to this webinar, that would be excruciating. They can just pause it later and do that. So again, they haven't taken up any answers from the previous one, and now you're moving into healthier responses. And the way that we set this up is to say that what works for one isn't going to work for everyone. So what you're looking at are responses or coping strategies or preventive strategies to manage your mental health, to manage your stress that other people have used successfully. But to understand, again, these are not going to work for you. So what we want you to do here is to check off the ones that you already use, that you already know work for you, and circle the ones that pique your interest that you might want to try. And I give an example that I work with someone who has her headset on, listening to music while she's writing reports or responding to email. I can't do that. I would have to start to dance or sing. I can't focus on both music and the written word. But that's okay. We each do what works for us. I have somebody else who doodles in meetings, and that works for them to focus their attention on what's being said. I just did a workshop recently, and a woman was knitting through the whole workshop, and at the end of it, she came and she handed me the hat that she made and said, I really appreciate you allowing me to do this, because when I'm knitting, I can focus more intently on what you're saying, and it really helps me. So thinking about that, you ask people to check off the ones that work for them and circle the ones they want to try. Now, this is a place where you're going to take time afterwards for people to share the ones they circled and see if anybody else at the table has ever done them and how they work for them. You can see that this is a safe conversation about positive things. We're not sharing the ones that we don't want to talk about, maybe the ones that we do already. We just want to share the ones that we're curious about, so it's safe sharing. And then when they're done with that, you can wrap it up and say, you know, that you really hope that people will explore that what works for them today may not work in the future, and what works in the future is going to depend on what their stressors are, and so that they're always to be open and curious about what works for them. So, David, what kinds of approaches do you use in terms of coping with stress, both preventative and in the moment?
So for myself, I noticed that I've started a mindfulness app that's actually helped me focus while I'm working. It helps me in school. I was actually surprised at how it actually affected me outside of that time, because I tried it just as something fun, just interested, and I was actually really surprised that it followed after the fact. I was expecting I want to feel those differences right away. It was a 10-minute session. I was like, I'll feel those. They probably won't last, but it was very interesting, and I've continued to do it. As you mentioned about the music, I found that that's something when I was in school helped a lot, but now it doesn't. And it was very cool to get something new and experience that change.
Perfect, thank you. And see, this is the type of conversation that you can have that really uplifts people. Because what you're going to do next is what I was so worried about when we created this. So in the evidence about resilience, it says you can't run and hide from your stressors. That's not resilience. You must face them. You must acknowledge them. You must be aware of them. But I'm worried that, you know, we're asking people to look at a list And check out the page right now of that list in the resource itself. And the page is there for work are 11 to 12 and school is 13 to 15. And you'll see that it's quite an extensive list. We originally thought, well, people should write it down, but that was more stressful. Whereas going through the list is easier on people, but it's also important that you set it up by saying, if you're reading this stressor in the list, it's because other people have dealt with it and have thrived beyond it. That's why these things, that's what resilience is for, is to say, yeah, a lot of these stressors can be difficult, but you can get through them. But you need to acknowledge them for a couple of reasons. One is that we need to acknowledge them because sometimes there's a big stressor that there's nothing we can do about other than change our mind, and we'll talk about that later. But that there's a lot of little stressors that we could either eliminate or change in a positive way. And that's what we want to know. So we're looking at the big picture of the big stressors, but we're also including the little stressors. Now, I also say to them, this isn't a contest. There's no prize for having the most stressors, and that you need to understand that the biggest stressor to you may be insignificant to someone else, that they could deal with it. So someone can have one stressor that's overwhelming, and somebody can have dozens of stressors, but they're just fine. They're coping just fine. They're not a big deal to them. So then we give people time to go through and fill it out on their own, and we remind them that they're not to share these or to talk about them to anyone at this session, that can happen later. The other thing is to say that we want them only to check off stressors that they're currently experiencing, especially someone my age. We might have dealt with almost all of them at one point or another. That's not what we're trying to do. We're only looking at the stressors that you're currently dealing with. So this can take a bit of time. You want to be very respectful that people can get through this and complete it. Again, you're looking for only one or two left holding their pen before you start to talk, and to make sure they get through it. Here's the thing. I don't want you ever to stop and take a break at this point. You can take a break before it. You can take a break after the next part is done. So you need to be very mindful of where you are. I usually get to after the next series of exercises before I stop, and I think that you can too in most sessions. The challenge is when you only have a 1-hour session, that you don't want to stop here, because now you've opened up for people all of the stressors they may be experiencing, and you haven't given them an opportunity to think about how they would deal with them. Okay, so here's how you deal with them, and this is where I want you to complete this section before you stop. So the 4 A's came from the University of Chicago, and we have adapted them a bit for what we're doing to make them easier for people to understand and to apply immediately. So we say that when we are dealing with stress, we are very likely in an emotional state. That's what stress is. And we are then thinking from a place of emotion instead of from a place of rational thinking. Even people who are very concrete linear thinkers, when they're stressed, their rational mind is not working optimally. So here's the 4 things that we want people to consider when they're dealing with a specific stressor. Can they accept it? Can they avoid it? Can they alter it? Or can they adapt it? And this is an important part of this, is they need to think of the pros and cons of each of those 4 things. So you're going to then walk them through what that means and give them an opportunity to take one stressor from the list of stressors they just did, one stressor that they think there's nothing they can do about. That's the best one to choose because it's the one where they're feeling most trapped and can see how this can help. So maybe it's taking care of a sick family member. Maybe it's dealing with an illness or disability themselves. Maybe it is a conflict. And so we want something like that because it really helps them understand that no matter what it is, there is a way to make it less stressful. So we go through these 4 before we get them to deal with the exercise itself. So here's the first thing, and accept doesn't mean suck it up and just say, too bad, you just have to deal with it. It really is looking at things that are outside of your control. So for instance, climate change, and we're talking about climate change anxiety now and people who feel like the world is going to fall apart any moment. And I think back to the Cold War and how everybody thought there was going to be a nuclear disaster any minute, and people lived with that fear all the time. It doesn't mean that we should be Pollyanna and just go, oh, it's all fine. It just means I can't single-handedly fix climate change. I'll do what I can do about it personally, maybe professionally, maybe as a social advocate, but I won't spend the time fearing and feeling worry about it because it's outside of my control. So we're saying, look at what you can do. I always go back to the serenity prayer just because I come from a long line of alcoholics, that you need to understand what you can control or change and what you can't, and have the wisdom to know the difference. And you take steps to do what you can, but the fear and the worry doesn't serve anybody, doesn't help anybody. So to look at challenges as opportunities for personal growth and learning. What can I do? What can I change? How can I learn? How can I be different? To share your feelings, so find other people who are going to listen to you respectfully, or that can help you understand what power you do have to make change, if there is some, but also, and most importantly, to reduce the power that your feelings have over your emotions. The feelings that you have about things that you can't change should help you to take action rather than just to feel badly. And then in terms of accepting relationships that are difficult, is to be able to learn to accept that people do what they do to fill their void or meet their needs. And to forgive means they can't or couldn't do any different at that time. And to move on means to move on in a way that's healthy for you. So that may mean staying in the relationship, but it may not. But what it is to accept that sometimes people just are who they are. And whether you want them in your life or not is your choice. But for you to be able to move on is where the quality of your life will come from. So accept. There's pros and cons to it, right? If I forgive this person, for instance, who may be abusing me, but I'm staying in the relationship and I'm just accepting, well, that's all they can do, is that good for me? And we don't know that. We, the people that are talking to them, but they can decide if that's the best thing for them to accept this right now, or is the best thing for them to end that relationship and move on. When we were doing work with victims of domestic violence, we asked them to do the pros and cons of staying in the relationship, not to talk them one way talk them into one way or the other, but to say you do have some choice here and to think about why you're making the choice immediately can reduce the sense of being trapped, that we have some choice. So that is the accept. And you can see that there's ways that we have written it out that you can share, but where you have stories, where you know somebody was able to change the way they fought against something that they had no control over, or the way they started to think differently about a person that they couldn't change and how that made their life better, those are the stories that you can add in here. And we talk about avoid, and it's funny, this is the one that gets the most reaction because people go, well, if you're avoiding, you're just in denial and you're not trying to deal with your stress. But I don't agree. I think there are times when avoiding certain stressors is your best possible choice. I have a colleague who, when she travels, she calls the hotel and says, if there's a mini bar in my room, I want you to empty it. I want no alcohol in my room. Well, she's a recovering alcoholic, and why should she have that kind of stress and temptation when she's traveling? It's not necessary. So yes, she's avoiding it, but it's like I try not to have chocolate in the house because I have no willpower to stop myself from eating it. So I avoid it, and it's a healthy coping strategy for me. There's certain people that maybe you haven't learned how to interact with in a way that's healthy for you to be able to say no and have boundaries. Well, if you avoid those people until you build up your ability to say no in a healthy and effective way and have those boundaries, then avoiding them might be okay. We look at the pros and cons because you need to know, well, if the person I'm avoiding is my spouse or my child, there are some downsides to doing that. So we want to look at both. At work, there are some stressors like noise, like lights, like a mess on your desk that cause you stress that you can change, you can avoid just by the way that you set yourself up. And we can avoid unnecessary stress by feeling overwhelmed all the time by just prioritizing a to-do list so that the things that we want to get done in a day are quite manageable, rather than having 3,000 things and always feeling incompetent. So avoiding can have both positives and negatives, and you want to look at that. And again, the page is there. It's got some ideas for you on how you might talk about it, but you can also add your own in for more interesting stories. We talk about altering. So in this case, we're talking about altering what's external. So your environment, like there's a story that I tell, which is insignificant to most people, but it really hammered home to me what it can mean. And I read something about micro stressors. So they're little things that aren't significant, but they stress you out every day. So somebody gave me a chest freezer, a little square freezer, but they left it in my kitchen. And I hated it there. I didn't like the look of it there, but I couldn't move it. So it was there for months and months until I read about this idea of micro stressors. So I paid somebody to move it for me. What had happened is every time I walked by it, I thought, that's just so ugly there. When they moved it, every time I walked by that space, I thought, oh, that looks so great. So I went from a micro stressor to a micro uplifter just by moving one piece of equipment. So that's what altering external environment can do for you in terms of changing your stress levels. We can also change routines, and this is important, especially for people who struggle with mental health issues. I have had so many people with depression say that one of the strategies they use to improve when they feel like they're sliding down towards depression is to change things in their life. So they may change their hairstyle, they change their food or alcohol consumption, they change how they move, how they exercise, they change what they watch on television or streaming or movies, and they'll even change things like the way they commute to work. And the point of all this altering is that if you are in a downward spiral because of stress, because of depression, and you change things, your mind has to change the direction that it's going, and it can be helpful to you. And then the other alter is about external situation is I can't change you. It's really hard for me to change me, but there's this place in between you and I that is our relationship. And I can change what is happening there. In other words, I can change what I say to you. I can change where we meet. I can change the circumstances of how we interact. These external elements of our relationship can make a big difference in my stress levels. And again, in your manual, you can find ways to discuss this, and but your stories are probably even better. And then the fourth one, the last one, is about adapting. So this is my thoughts and changing them in order for me to deal with the stressor. And there's something that people in the therapy world will say, and Brené Brown, who has done all that work on vulnerability, has made more popular recently, is the question, what is the story you're telling yourself? And that is something that is so powerful in the moments of stress and emotion. If we think, not what are the facts of this situation, but what is the story I'm telling myself about it? So for instance, if I've been in a car accident, that's a bad thing. And maybe I'm injured, and maybe I'm dealing with some emotional backlash from the accident. But if I ask what is the story I'm telling myself, I might find that what I'm telling myself is the world's not a safe place. I think the universe is out to get me. I'm a really bad driver. I should never get behind the wheel again. Once we understand the story we're telling ourselves, then we can start to deal with that. Because it's not, okay, accidents happen, I was in one, that's not great, I'm in pain, those are the facts, but the story I'm telling myself may be causing me more stress than the facts of it. And once I understand it, I can look at it. So in this one, we talk about something as simple as saying, I'm so tired, I can't sleep, I really am, to reframing it as a desired solution, which is I need to improve the quality of my sleep. And, you know, even as I'm telling you this, I can feel the physical difference between the I'm so tired, I can't sleep, to I need to improve the quality of my sleep, which is I need to find ways, I need to find solutions, I need to do something to improve it. And I mean, something as simple as that, we know that if you actually turn your devices off a couple to 3 hours before you sleep, it makes a huge difference. We know that if you stop eating at least 3 hours before you sleep, it makes a huge difference. We know that for some people, listening to some of the apps that are soothing meditations to help you physically relax and for your mind to relax, it makes a huge difference. So now instead of saying, I can't sleep, I'm starting to focus on what could I do differently in order to improve my sleep. So adapting is changing the way we look at a problem. We also could consider what the consequences of taking various actions. So if we stay with the sleep one, okay, well, if I have to turn my devices off at 9 o'clock, I mean, what about those times when I have to work till midnight, and what would that be? How would that affect my work? And you could say, well, maybe you make an exception a couple of times a month. You know, you can really look at if in the big picture I'm more alert and effective than these few times when I need to take a break, that's okay. And then to set clear and reasonable expectations and standards for yourself, that goes back to what's the story I'm telling myself. Am I telling myself that if I'm not perfect all the time, I'm a loser, I'm a failure? And is that reasonable? We have to stop and think about whether we're holding ourselves to such a ridiculous expectation of perfection that we're creating our own stress. So those are the 4, and what you're going to do after this is say, now take that stressor and go to the appropriate page, 19 for students and 16 for people in the workplace, and write out both the pros and cons of doing each of these 4 things in terms of that stressor. And I always add, if you need some help, if you're not sure how you would do any of these things or one of these things for this stressor, just raise your hand and I'll come over. So what that means to you as the facilitator is you should spend a little bit of time thinking about difficult stressors like a terminal illness, like a bad relationship, and think about how each of these 4 things could add or take away from the stress that somebody is experiencing, just so that you feel comfortable helping people out. I had a really interesting one where someone said, well, my stress is that my boss won't let me flex my time, and I have child care issues. And I said, you know, so you can't get child care or what? And in the end, what we understood is her stressor wasn't child care issues. She could solve that. Her stressor was that her previous boss trusted her and this one didn't. So sometimes it's actually helping them identify the issue, the real issue that's causing stress, as opposed to what they state as the stressor. And then you can go from there to help them look at what they can do about it. So I'm going to say this is where now you're going to give them the time to go through it all, and this is where I would take a break for people and let them do that. So if you're listening to the recording of this webinar, you can also put it on pause and then go take a break. If those of you who are listening to it live, please take the break as you need to. We're going to keep going through so that this is consistent. So the next one, once you have helped people go through dealing with their stressors, and let me just say to you, sorry, I'll just go back to it. This piece here is the piece that inevitably comes back as the most important learning that people take away and use from this resource. So don't skimp your time on it. Don't skimp your time in explaining it or in them filling it out because it is important. But again, because they're talking about something that may be personal, emotional, you want to give them enough time, but to suggest, again, that they not share that. All right. Balancing your support network. My concern in doing this one is there may be people that don't have a support network. People that spent their whole life focused on work and never developed or maintained relationships, or students that are away from home and family and don't know anybody in the school system yet. So we want to talk about the fact that you can build your social support network at any time, that your social support network can consist of family and friends, but it can also consist of professionals like counselors, like your doctor, like your professor, like student services, like the HR professional. They don't have to be friends. They have to be people who can support you when you need support. But the other part of social support network is who are the people that you support, that you provide help to. And that's a great place to start. If you feel that you don't have the support network that you want, start reaching out to other people, volunteer, notice when somebody is isolated or alone and reach out to them. See if you can help build their support network. But all these people that you reach out to help to, provide help to, they are all excellent candidates for your social support network when you need them. Here's how we talk about the social support network. That no one person, whether it's your spouse, your sibling, your significant other, your friend, your parent, no one person can be all things to you. You need to diversify, not just because it's a lot of responsibility for that one person, but because they may not have the skills, the talents, the abilities, the strengths that you need when you're in need. So what we want to do is to think about what different people have as their ability to support you. For example, I may want someone who's just going to give me a pat on the back and say, Mary Ann, of course you're right and the rest of the world is wrong. Whether that's true or not, sometimes that's what I'm looking for. I just want someone to be on my side. There are times, actually many more times, where I want someone to give me a shake, virtually, not physically, thank you, to say, I don't know what you're thinking, but somehow your perspective is skewed. You need to give your head a shake. You need to think about this differently. I don't know why you're putting yourself through this. I don't know why you're thinking this way. And that may or may not be the same person who can just agree with me. Sometimes I want people to say, yeah, you got problems. We all got problems. You know what? Let's just go out and have a laugh. And that may be the most important approach to dealing with stress in that moment for me. We need to know what we want and who can give it to us if we want to have a really effective social support network. I have a friend who's a grief counselor, and she says, if you need a shoulder to cry on, I am always here for you. If you're stuck and need someone to shovel your walk, don't call me. So there's many different things that we need support for. Sometimes they're to do errands. Sometimes they're to help us with a project or a problem. Sometimes they're to help us think through an issue. We need to know who and where. So what we want to instruct people to do here is to go to that page and to begin to fill in, first of all, the people that they provide that kind of support to, and to say, if you don't provide that kind of support, that's okay. That's the whole point, right? We can't be all things to all people. So what we want them to do instead is to write out the initials. They can put a line through the ones where they don't provide that kind of support, and then they're to go to the other side, and they're to fill it in with the people that provide that kind of support effectively for them. And the whole point, and this is how you wrap it up, is if there's gaps on the side of where you get support from, or if you feel the one person who can do it isn't always available to you, then to start to look for other people in your world who maybe could provide that, and look for the people who you can reach out and help. It's really interesting because people have come up to me afterwards and somebody said, yeah, I put my husband down for a lot of this, and I took a picture and sent it to him and said, congratulations, you're very supportive. So different people get different things, but we always want to wrap up saying, if you feel your social support network isn't what you want it to be, congratulations, because now you understand, you know what you need, and you can build it. And you build it often by helping others. Okay, so that's the support network. That's also a big aha moment for people. And then you get to the strengths. And this is what we've been asking in advance and then asking again when they come in to go online and do it. And the reason we want them to is because the strengths are actually in the back of their resource. They're, I think, the last page. And so they could look through them and pick them themselves and then do the exercise. But the truth is that we often will pick what we value rather than what our natural strengths are. And then we may not get out of this what we really want. And let me explain that. I may really value determination, but I may be somebody who, when the going gets tough, I just withdraw and give up. So even though I think determination is a strength that's important to me, it's not one that comes naturally to me. And so that's what we want them to identify, is the strengths that come naturally to them. And I always tell my own story. So I went on, did the VIA Strengths Inventory, and my top strength was forgiveness. And I thought, forgiveness? Like, what a lame strength that is. I don't know any superhero who has forgiveness as their top strength. What a waste. I can be a professional doormat. That's what I can do with that. But then, of course, as I found out many times in my life, I was wrong. When I read forgiveness, I started to understand why it's so important in my work, because I'm often dealing with people who are stressed out, who are traumatized, who may even be in crisis. And some of the things that they say can be hurtful. They're lashing out. They're in a place where they're feeling cornered, they're feeling attacked. I understand that people attack when they're feeling cornered and that it's not about me. I just happen to be in front of them at that moment. I can let it go. I can forgive. And even in my personal life, I understand that people do what they do to meet their own needs or fill their own void, and that I just happen to be in front of them when they do things that are hurtful to me, but that it's really not about me, it's about them. Forgiveness for me is critical in what I do, and I now appreciate it differently. The exercise that we ask people to do is say, how do you leverage your top 1, 2, or 3 strengths in a time of stress and crisis? How do you purposefully, intentionally leverage it? So you think about forgiveness. Well, if I'm in a crisis, if I'm in a place of stress, what? I forgive you? That's not going to be very helpful. But understanding what forgiveness really is can be helpful. I can go, oh, this is just, I can't believe this is happening. And then I can go, wait a minute. Let's think about the people that are involved. What might be motivating them? What might be driving them? And I can get out of my own head, get out of my own stress and emotion, and really think more objectively about what people are going through in that situation. And it not only helps me understand them, get out of my head, but it also helps me to think, okay, how could we change this situation now? I'm using my strength for that. And this is a really beautiful thing when you have the time, is to get everybody to do it, to get them to share at their table how they would use their strengths in a moment of crisis. You can say to the audience, if you're not sure how to leverage your strengths and ask me. And you can get, once they've shared at their table, you can get people to volunteer to share with a larger group, so you can get, even more examples. With this one, though, if they're thinking about something that they value but isn't a personal strength, it's not going to be easy for them to use it in a time of stress and crisis, because now they're pushing it, right? They're trying to shore up their weakness, and the whole point is whatever comes easy to me will come easier to me in a stress or crisis than something that doesn't come easy to me. Okay? Any questions about the strengths inventory? Let me know. But this is, again, a really powerful tool to help people to not feel useless when they're trying to draw on their weaknesses in a time of stress. All right. So again, there's some of the stories that are there. If you can do your own strengths inventory and, like me, use your story of discovery, that's probably even better. And then that's just telling you there's so much, if you're ever interested, there's so much we can learn about strengths. For instance, my bottom strength, so they're all the strengths are there, and they're just ranked from beginning to end. So it doesn't mean you don't have the ones at the bottom. It means that's not the ones that come easy to you. So the strength that was at the bottom for me was appreciation of beauty. And that makes sense to me because I'm always in my head. I don't care what you look like. I actually just care what your eyes are telling me versus what your mouth is telling me. If you asked me, about a painting, it's like, yeah, that's nice or it's not nice. I don't really care that much. But what I know is when we use the least easy strength, so for me, this appreciation of beauty, when I purposely, intentionally try to use that, it takes me out of my head. So it's almost like mindfulness to start to use those character strengths at a time when you want to refocus or distract yourself. So there's lots of other ways we can think about what we learn from this, but it's not part of this session. It's just something good for you to know so that if people talk about strengths, what it is. The other thing is that we can overuse them. So for me, forgiveness, if I just give it away without ever thinking about why, if I just say, no, you can kick me when I'm down, you can be rude to me because I'm always going to forgive you, that's an overuse of a strength that can become problematic for you. So this is another piece that you need to know around strengths. All right. So then we get to work resilience and academic resilience. And these are ways that we can bounce back better at work or at school when we're dealing with the particular stressors there. The thing about work resilience is there's many people who are these overachieving perfectionists who drive themselves to the point of burnout, illness, disability. And what we're trying to do with the work resilience is to say there's better ways for you to think about and plan for a healthier work life, taking some of the stress away. Why do people never take days off? They may be worried that someone's going to find out they're incompetent. They may feel that they're letting people down, that they're a burden on others. They may feel that they will be seen or judged as incompetent or not caring. And so what we're trying to deal with in the work resilience is all of those resistance. In the academic resilience is similar. It's these students that just drive themselves so much that they crash and burn. And we know that that's very common because it's often the first time that these individuals have been away from home and not having parents to control or make strong suggestions about maintaining balance in life. This particular piece we often don't have time for in the session. And this is an area where I will often say, if it's work resilience, bring it back and do it with your team, because it's a great team activity to fill that out, talking about when I'm sick and what happens and who has to cover for me. And doing that before someone is ill is a great way to get the team to become more supportive and more effective to deal with absences. In the academic resilience, it's the same thing by getting students to do this as a conversation. So if you have your 3 hours and you can get the students to talk about these things, that's great. But they also need somebody probably from student services who can say, oh, here's where you would go, here's who you would talk to. The other thing that you can do is to host this as a second session, if you can, and just bring people back to talk about each of the questions in this area. All right. And this piece here, I feel, is probably one of the most important pieces. It's also the piece that people have a lot of fun with afterwards. And it is micro changes, meaning that they're not difficult to make, that are particularly aimed at building resilience in small ways. And what we do is we go through all of them with them and ask them to commit to just one, because we say that if you do many more, you're going to stress yourself out, but also that you really want to take the time to build a new habit before it actually takes and you try another one. So you can turn to the facilitator notes for this one on the pages that are shown. And what you're going to see there is just the way that we can talk about it. So I would walk them through it this way. So the first one is really that idea of post-traumatic growth that we talked about. That, of course, you're going to have disappointments, challenges, frustrations, but what we want you to do for 3 weeks, and we want you to have somebody to hold you accountable for this and to check in with, what we want you to do is every time something that's less than positive that happens in your day, that you stop and think, what could I take from this? What could I learn from this? How could I grow from this? And intentionally try to apply the process of post-traumatic growth. Now, if it's a big, huge trauma, of course, that's not the place for you to use this, but it's for those little things that happen every day. All of these are meant to be fun, and you can imagine that you just spilt the coffee all over yourself and you go, okay, I have to have some post-traumatic growth here. What the heck am I going to learn from this? So that's the first one. The second one comes from a motivational speaker named Mel Robbins, and she is the author of the 5-second rule. And what she describes is a time in her life where she didn't want to get out of bed in the morning. She often put her alarm on pause, which made her children late for work, for school, and she was drinking too much. She was unemployed and just generally not having a good time in life. She watched a NASA space shuttle take off, and they went 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the rocket took off. And she said, geez, I wish I could do that, just 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'd get out of bed in the morning, I'd do my exercises, I'd eat things that were healthier. And then she started to think, well, why can't I? And she started to do that when a thought came in her head to do something that she knew was good for her, rather than waiting for motivation or willpower, which we all know is very limited and is often used only for those things that we know are going to give us an immediate positive charge, that you eliminate the need for motivation. You go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you do it. So the story I tell about this one is that I hate talking on the phone. I can't see your face. I can't read your eyes, your body language. I get distracted, and it feels like work. So I don't like talking on the phone, but I know that there's some relatives of mine that want me to call them and that I know I should call. And what I do now is, instead of going, yeah, I should call them when I've got nothing to do, I can give them my attention when I really feel like talking on the phone, which doesn't ever happen, I think of that person and I go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, I pick up the phone. And you know what? It's never as bad as I think it's going to be, and I always feel better after I hang up that I've made that effort to connect. So that's the next one, is whenever you're feeling or thinking about something you should do, not things that are illegal or immoral, but things that you should do, go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and just do it. Just do it. The next one is using the 4 A's that we discussed earlier, and it doesn't matter whether you use the pages and write it all down, pros and cons, or if you feel comfortable enough just to do it in your head, but the idea is to apply this to stressors on a daily basis, to really think about how could I accept, avoid, alter, or adapt to this stressor, and what are the pros and cons of each, and thinking about what you could do. The next one's all about appreciation, and we know that the emotion of gratitude is almost the exact opposite of the emotion that comes with depression. And so the more you can train your brain to be grateful, the better the quality of your life can be. But the thing is you need to be specific about what you're grateful for. So if you say, well, I'm grateful for the sun and the moon and the stars and my family, that just sounds like, well, you know, those kinds of things that you just say. Whereas if you say, I'm really grateful for the sun streaming onto this table right now and watching that bird outside, it's very specific to that moment, and that's what changes your brain approach, your brain chemistry. So thinking about expressing appreciation as often as you can for very specific things for 3 weeks. The next one is really about looking at mistakes and thinking about what you learned and what you would do next time. And this is about helping you not beat yourself up every time you do something that's less than perfect. It's what we have on here is Nelson Mandela said he didn't use the word trial and error. He used the words trial and learning, because that's what you do. You make a mistake, you learn from it, and you move on. If we make a mistake and we just feel like we're a failure, we ruminate about it, we go over and over it, and it brings us down. So we need to see mistakes as an opportunity to learn, and you need to intentionally write down, what did you learn from that mistake? What would you do differently? And then the second last one is about saying yes. And you have to say yes every time somebody offers to help you. And this one gets really funny because, you know, somebody will say, oh, can I help you with dinner? And you're thinking, no, I don't want you to help me. I like doing it by myself. But you have to say yes because you're committed to it for 3 weeks. If somebody says, can I help you with that report? And you think, no, I want to do it myself. You still have to say yes. And there's a couple of things that you get from this. One is you learn not to be so independent that you're shutting people out. But the other thing is that you learn that people are there to help. They want to help. You might shut them out and shut them down and think you're doing everything on your own. But if you're really open to it, you'll realize there's lots of people who do want to help. And then the last one is about self-talk. And I always say, if somebody followed me around saying some of the things that I used to say on a regular basis, you idiot, what a moron you are, how could you be so stupid, I would have them up on harassment charges. And yet what we know is when we say these things to ourselves, often, every day, the impact on our well-being is the same as if somebody else was doing it. So we need to learn to change that. We need to take that critic and look at it differently. And just to add a piece that's not down here, is one of the ways that we can deal with the inner critic is to know that there's something they're trying to protect us from or something they're trying to help us with. They're just going about it in a really bad way. So for instance, if my inner critic is saying, how could you be so stupid? It's probably saying, you know this, you've got this, you can do this differently, I believe in you. But it's saying it in a way that can be hurtful. So what if we actually saw the inner critic, wondered how they were trying to help us, and then switched the language to one of help and support? So the idea here is now you're going to give them time to say, pick one of these that you'll commit to for 3 weeks and write down the name of the person that you're going to ask to hold you accountable to do this. So in 3 weeks, they're going to call you up or come and see you and ask you how it went. And then at that point, if you want to, you can add another one. You can keep the one that you were doing if it worked well for you or not, and you can add another one. And that's, these micro changes help you to build resilience. All right. And again, walks you through it in the book so that you've got it. This next one, again, is one that we often don't do if we don't have time, but I always explain it. And to say that when we were working with people with depression, we understood that even if they had dealt with an episode of depression before, did the work to get well, and were well for many years, even if they've been through an episode and recovered a few times, it's not unusual that when they're depressed again, that they feel like this time is different. This time I'm not going to get better. And so we do something with them where we ask them to write down all of the things that they enjoy in life, all of the things that bring them joy, and all of the feelings that they feel when they're well. And we ask them to put it on the fridge. And the reason we do that is because often it's very gradual, that the thinking starts to change to not enjoying the things you used to enjoy and not feeling the feelings. And so as soon as they recognize that what they had written down no longer applies, it's an early warning sign that something's different. The reason this works is because the type of the part of the brain that recognizes your own written word is different than the type of brain that engages in the negativity. And so you'll remember you wrote this even when you're not in the frame of mind to accept it. So the point here is you write your stressors that you are likely to have on an ongoing basis, and you write down a couple of coping strategies that you know would be helpful. When you actually are feeling that stressor, for instance, like loneliness, that you can see, oh, I've had this before, and I've dealt with it before, and this is what I did, and it can help bring you back. So please make sure you explain it to them why it would work, and then if you don't have time for them to do it there, that's okay. They can do it at another time for themselves. This next piece is one that it can be done in a number of ways, but the one way that doesn't seem to work well is to say, fill it out right now on your own. So the concept is that we want them to be aware of the resources that exist, especially to deal with stress, before they actually need them. But asking somebody to sit in a workshop and fill it all in has never been very successful. So there's a couple of ways that I want to share with you that you can do it. You can have the organization or the school complete it as much as they can. Some of them are personal, like your doctor, but to complete it as much as they can in advance, and you can read them out to the students or to the employees and get them to handwrite it themselves. The reason we don't want you just to photocopy it and give it to them is there is, as we just explained, a different part of the brain that registers things that we write out. So we want them to physically write it out. You can put them all on slides and just integrate them into your presentation, or you can just read them and tell them a little bit about what each resource can do for them, so that they know, okay, well, you go to HR for issues about your benefits, but we have therapists if you want somebody to talk to about your mental health issues, and we have, you know, other people that can help you with career decisions. So you help them to understand who to go to for what and when. Again, this is something that you could bring back for people to do in smaller groups if you have the time. Maybe you could do the academic and work resilience along with this as a separate session, or, as I say, give it to them. If you have no other choice, then do photocopy what is available that you know is already available and hand it out. At least it's something. Okay. This here is just to say a lot of people will think that they need to buy, and actually something I say right in the very beginning, some people don't want to write on it, on the actual resource, because they really like it and they want to be able to use it with somebody else. But tell them at the beginning, go ahead and write on that one. There's extra copies free for download anytime you want, so you don't need to save it. But again, you can reiterate this at the end and just say these resources are free. If you want another one, if you want to do it with a friend or a family member, you can get it from here. All right, and then we give them an opportunity to ask questions or to make comments about it, and you can do it voluntarily, or if there's certain things you want to pull out, this is the time for you to do it, like, you know, does this organization have what you need to be resilient? Are there resources you're concerned about and we can write them up and bring them forward? Are there things that you're going to do differently? So, preparing for the session. These are some things for you to do. So this is the logistics end of the webinar. If you prepare all the time and for workshops in your own workplace or your own place, you might not need this, but this is just to help. So there's a pre-planning worksheet which I'm going to show you next, and you can use that to get information. And you should do that about 1 month before or at the time when they say they want to do it. You want to ask the organizer to complete the potential resources that we just talked about, and that you can print them or you can use them in your presentation. If you're from outside, or even if you're not, you want to have someone who is knowledgeable about the resources in the organization that can answer questions if they come up. So just whether it's the organizer themselves or it's somebody else, have somebody sitting in your session that can answer these questions from the audience if they come up. You want to ask the organizer to print the copies of Plan for Resilience and or From Surviving to Thriving, but know that there's digital, they can use it digitally too, that people can fill them out online. But you want to make sure that those exist. Those copies aren't free, so someone has to print them and provide them. I have had people just do them as photocopies. That's okay if that's what you want to do. Usually they'll saddle stitch them on the short end, which means that there's the cover has, and the pages have 2 staples in them. I don't know why they call that saddle stitch, but that's what it is. We also have printed them with coil binds on the short end as well. But any of those are fine, but usually whoever is organizing the session will produce those. 2 weeks prior is when you want to send out the VME survey link to make sure that participants can do that in advance. And remember that I showed you where the email wording is for that you can send to them. You want to check that the AV, audiovisual equipment, is going to be okay. You need a projector and a screen. You don't need sound for the presentation, but if the room's big enough, or if you have someone with hearing issues that may be participating, then you need a microphone. So make sure you understand whether that is needed or not. And I always try to bring the presentation on a USB as well as on my laptop. I always prefer to present off my own laptop because I know it's going to work and how it's going to work. But just in case for some reason they can't do that, make sure that you have it on a USB as well so you're set no matter what happens. You want to review the evidence in the Queen's study in advance so that if someone asks questions, you're not flipping through to answer them. Most of the time I don't get any questions at all, and you're going to tell them a little bit about the evidence up front anyways. 2 days before the session, you just want to check that there's somebody who can respond if somebody's distressed. It's never happened to me, just so you know. This is not something that is very triggering, but what if somebody is already in a really vulnerable place and this is upsetting to them in some way? If you have someone, the organizer, if you have somebody on HR staff, if you have someone in student services, if you're doing with students, someone who says, yes, I can be there and I can at least connect them to someone that can be helpful. I think it's just with me, because that's my skill set, I will do it myself, feel confident that I can handle it myself, except if it's a large audience, because I can't leave. So think about that and think about who could be there. You make sure that they have sent you back the potential resources form and that they've printed enough copies of the resource for every participant. This is just sort of a double check, right, a couple days before. You make sure that there is a volunteer to distribute the resources as the participants arrive. This is important when you're doing a dual session. So you've got some that are using Plan for Resilience and some that are using From Surviving to Thriving, because you literally have to talk to every person coming in to make sure they've got the one that they want. Even though when you bring it up, you can say, if you feel you've got the wrong one, just put your hand up and we'll get someone to give you the other one. But it's hard for you to set up and be available to people if you're also sitting there giving those out. You can double check that you've got the equipment that you need. You can double check the seating plan. So this is important. If people are only in an auditorium without those little tables that come out from the side, then they need something to write on, and it's not very conducive to the type of session you're giving. It's much better that they have a writing surface. So they don't necessarily have to be at table and chairs, but you've got a couple places where they're going to be chatting, and so it is easier. But know what you're going to be faced with so that you know how you're going to facilitate that. What we have done in some cases is we actually bound the resource on the long edge so that they flipped it over, and we used cardstock for the cover, And what that means is that you're actually giving them a writing with the resource. It's not ideal, but it can work. You want to know about parking for yourself, but also for participants who might get in touch with you and say, where can I park? How can I get there? You need to know when you can get into the room and meet the organizer so that you can set up. You need to know if there's any security requirements and if you are using Wi-Fi. Remember, if you're asking people to do the VME survey, they need to connect. So then you need to know the Wi-Fi username and password. And what I've done in those cases is I've either put it on a flip chart on a whiteboard, or I've actually changed the slide to include it. So that's how people know how to get on if it's not their normal workplace. And then this is just saying that you set it up, have that title screen with the VME on, again, the Wi-Fi. Make sure that the booklets are either on the registration table or you just put them out. If it's a smaller group or it's a single-use group, meaning plan for resilience or from surviving to thriving, you can just put them on the table. And I'm just saying if someone's there, they can also ask, have you done the survey? And if not, you'll see it on the slide and you can do it right now. So that's some of the setup. This is the pre-planning worksheet. And you can see it just gives you the opportunity to get the information that'll be useful for you. So the contact for the organizer. You want to know the start and end time for the session, how many people you can read through this, the room, name or number, how many tables, desks, how many people are at each table, all of that with the seating arrangement, when you can set up. I always like to arrive an hour early, but sometimes I can't get in. So you need to know, are they only going to have the room at the start time, in which case you've really got to be ready to move and get things going quickly. And yeah, equipment. So it's just a place for you to write it, but I want to bring your attention to the bottom of that page, page 70 of your facilitator's guide, because it says, have there been any significant incidents in the last couple of months, such as suicide, death, violence, or rape, that may be on the minds of the participants? And the reason you want to know that is you just want to be sensitive to what people might be thinking about while you're talking, and being careful not to minimize their stressors, and to continually say, this is about talking about everyday stress or after a very significant stressor or trauma. It's not for intervention in those really serious things. So if you get in there and you're blindsided by people reacting, that's not a good thing. You want to know in advance if there's something that you should know about. And of course, this is the organizer knowing about what the general population in that workplace or school would know. You need to be aware that we never know for sure what is going on in people's lives. But when it's a really big, commonly held trauma or experience, that's what you're really looking for. All right. I think that's the end of the Train the Trainer. And I want to go back to, does anybody have any questions or comments about this? Karen, are you on the line?
I am on the line.
Yeah. Did you get any questions or comments about the Train the Trainer for Plan?
No questions as of yet.
Okay. So we can assume that it was self-explanatory then. and end there, but to say we're always open to questions or comments. You can use the Contact Us on workplacestrategiesformentalhealth.com, and we'll do our best to help you through there. Thank you very much, and we hope that you can really help improve lives by building resilience.